our identity, which was, I think, around the Rage for Order album.
Eddie Jackson never demanded the spotlight. He never needed his name in bold letters or his face plastered across magazine covers. For more than 40 years, he stood in the shadows of the stage, anchoring one of progressive metal's most ambitious bands with a bassline that rarely screamed for attention but always held everything together. While others grabbed headlines, Eddie remained in the background, steady and unshaken. But that quietness came at a cost few ever saw. Behind the calm exterior of a man who seemed content to let others take the glory was a journey marked by loss, betrayal, and the slow unraveling of everything he helped build. This is what really happened to Eddie Jackson. Born on January 29, 1961, in Robstown, Texas, Eddie's early years were far removed from the chaos that would later define his professional life. His childhood carried none of the dramatic upheaval or family tragedy often found in rock and roll origin stories. There were no broken homes, no survival against impossible odds. Just a boy growing up in a small Texas town where music became a natural part of life long before he understood what it could mean. Public details about his family remain scarce, a reflection of the privacy Eddie would guard fiercely throughout his career. What mattered most was not where he came from, but what he was drawn to. Music did not arrive as an escape. It arrived as a calling. During his teenage years, Eddie's family relocated to Washington State, a move that would quietly change the trajectory of his entire life. If Texas had been shaped by country twang and southern blues, the Pacific Northwest was becoming a breeding ground for hard rock and heavy metal. The shift in landscape brought Eddie into contact with a growing community of young musicians who shared his hunger. At 14, he picked up an acoustic guitar. By 16, he had moved on to electric guitar, then bass, then drums. He did not settle on one instrument because he wanted to master a single role. He explored them all because he wanted to understand how music worked from the inside out. That curiosity would later become one of his greatest strengths as a bassist. He never saw the bass as a tool for simply keeping time. He saw it as part of the architecture, a foundational element that could carry melody, tension, and emotion all at once. It was during those high school years in Redmond, Washington, that Eddie met Scott Rockenfield, another teenager obsessed with music. That friendship, formed in the hallways and parking lots of suburban adolescence, would become the most important relationship of Eddie's life. Neither of them knew it yet, but they had just taken the first step toward building something that would last decades and cost them more than they could imagine. In 1980, Eddie Jackson stepped into his first real band. Cross Plus Fire was nothing more than a group of high school friends with big dreams and a setlist full of other people's songs. Eddie, Scott Rockenfield, and Michael Wilton spent their nights playing Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, and AC/DC covers in small clubs around Seattle. They were not yet writing their own material. They were not yet thinking about record deals or international tours. They were simply young men learning what it meant to stand on a stage and hold an audience's attention. For Eddie, this was the beginning of something far larger than he could have anticipated. Cross Plus Fire gave him his first taste of performing under pressure, of working within a group where every member had to pull their weight. It also deepened his bond with Scott Rockenfield, a relationship that would anchor his life for the next 3 decades. Before long, the band began to evolve. Chris DeGarmo joined the lineup, and with him came a shift in ambition. The group was no longer content to play covers in dive bars. They wanted to write their own music, to create something that belonged to them alone. Cross Plus Fire became the Mob, and the Mob began to take itself seriously. DeGarmo and Wilton brought complex guitar arrangements. Rockenfield built intricate rhythmic foundations. Eddie's bass lines started to carry melodic weight, weaving through the songs rather than simply supporting them. They were moving towards something distinctive, something that did not sound like the other metal bands flooding the Seattle scene. But they were still missing one crucial piece. Jeff Tate was singing for another band when the Mob first approached him. He had no interest in joining permanently. He agreed to record a few demo tracks as a favor, nothing more. But the moment his voice cut through the instrumental layers the band had been constructing, everything changed. Tate's range was staggering. His delivery was theatrical, emotional, and powerful in a way that elevated the music beyond standard heavy metal fare. The other members knew immediately that they had found the final piece of the puzzle. It took time to convince him, but Tate eventually agreed to join. With his arrival, the classic lineup was complete. In 1982, the group recorded a 4-song demo. One track stood out above the rest. Queen of the Reich was unlike anything the Seattle metal scene had heard before. It combined technical precision with atmospheric storytelling, a fusion that would become the band's signature. The song gave the group its new identity. They dropped the name The Mob and became Queensryche, a deliberate misspelling that set them apart from the crowd. The demo was pressed in small numbers and sold locally. No one expected it to travel far. But it did. The Queensryche EP arrived in 1983 like a quiet earthquake. The band had pressed only a few thousand copies, expecting to sell to local metal enthusiasts and maybe a handful of dedicated fans beyond the Pacific Northwest. Instead, something unexpected happened. The EP spread through underground metal networks across America. Critics took notice. Fans who had never heard of Seattle began seeking out these songs. Tracks like The Lady Wore Black and Night Rider revealed a band that understood both the raw power of traditional heavy metal and the artistic ambition of progressive rock. This was not a novelty. This was a legitimate artistic statement from musicians who had clearly spent years developing their craft. EMI Records came calling. Within a few short years, Eddie Jackson had transformed from a music-loving student in suburban Washington to a member of a professional band signed to a major label. It felt like a dream, but it was also the moment when everything became real in a way that could never be undone. The Warning arrived in 1984, Queensryche's official debut album. It was ambitious without being pretentious, heavy without sacrificing melody. The album showed the band had no interest in following trends. They were charting their own course, building a sound that was uniquely theirs. For Eddie, the album represented something crucial. His bass work was no longer confined to demo tracks. It was now part of a fully realized artistic vision, pressed onto vinyl and distributed across the country. He had proven he could contribute to something meaningful at the highest professional level. 2 years later, Rage for Order pushed the band even further from conventional metal structures. The music grew more sophisticated, more layered, more ambitious in scope. By the late 1980s, Queensryche had established themselves as serious artists with something genuine to say. But the real turning point came with Operation Mindcrime in 1988. This was not just an album. It was a concept album, a full narrative told through music, a world that the listener could enter and inhabit. The album told the story of a man's descent into political violence and psychological manipulation. It was dark, theatrical, and undeniably brilliant. I Don't Believe in Love earned the band its first Grammy nomination, a recognition that suddenly placed Queensryche on a stage much larger than underground metal. For Eddie Jackson, this was the moment when everything he had worked toward seemed to finally be paying off. The band were no longer just technically skilled musicians from Seattle. They were artists with something to say, and the world was beginning to listen. Then came Empire in 1990. This album was different. Silent Lucidity became a radio hit, a song that crossed far beyond the boundaries of traditional metal audiences. The song was beautiful and haunting, proving that Queensryche could create art that appealed to mainstream listeners without compromising their vision. Suddenly, the band was everywhere. Large venues opened up. Tours expanded in scope and ambition. Eddie Jackson was living the dream he and Scott Rockenfield had first imagined in high school parking lots. Success arrived with a shadow attached. The Empire Tour took Queensryche around the world, but it also pulled the band members into a relentless cycle of buses, hotels, and stages. Home became a distant memory. Weeks turned into months away from families, from normal life, from anything resembling stability. The touring schedule was exhausting in ways that no amount of adoration from crowds could compensate for. In 1990, during a show in Belgium, a tragedy occurred that would haunt the band forever. An audience member died during their performance. It was not the band's fault in any direct sense, but the weight of that loss became part of their story, a reminder that the stage they commanded carried consequences beyond the music itself. Operation Live Crime, recorded in 1991, captured the band at the absolute peak of their live performance. They were tighter than ever, more confident, more polished. But the album also marked an ending, though none of them fully recognized it at the time. The classic lineup that had built Queensryche's foundation was still intact, still united, still moving forward together. But cracks were forming beneath the surface, invisible fractures that would eventually tear the band apart. The 1990s arrived with Queensryche in a position most bands could only dream of. They were successful beyond their early expectations. They had artistic credibility. They had a loyal fan base. But the musical landscape around them was shifting in ways they could not control. Grunge exploded across America in 1991 and 1992. Alternative rock became the dominant force in mainstream music. Seattle, the city that had birthed Queensryche, was suddenly famous for a different kind of sound entirely. Nirvana, Alice in Chains, Pearl Jam, these bands were capturing the attention of a new generation. Queensryche's position in the broader musical conversation began to shift. They were no longer at the forefront. They were being pushed toward the margins, relegated to the status of legacy act rather than current forces. It was a subtle change at first, barely noticeable in terms of actual sales or touring capacity. But for the band members, many of whom had spent their entire adult lives at the center of attention, the shift felt like a betrayal by the very audience they had helped build. Promised Land arrived in 1994, more introspective and reflective than anything the band had released since their earliest days. The album was well crafted and intelligent, but fan reactions were divided. Some appreciated the band's willingness to evolve. Others felt the band was losing its edge, becoming too cerebral, too removed from the visceral power that had drawn them in the first place. By the mid-1990s, the certainty that had defined Queensryche's rise was beginning to crumble. The band that had seemed invincible in 1990 suddenly found itself questioning everything. And for Eddie Jackson, the man who had remained steady through every change, the ground beneath his feet was becoming uncertain in ways he had never anticipated. In 1998, Chris DeGarmo announced his departure from Queensryche. The news shocked the metal community, but for Eddie Jackson, it carried a weight that went far beyond a simple lineup change. DeGarmo was not just a bandmate. He was a friend who had been there since the beginning, since the days when Cross Plus Fire was playing covers in small clubs. DeGarmo had helped write some of the band's greatest songs. He had been part of nearly every major decision, every creative breakthrough, every moment that mattered. His absence created a void that no replacement could ever fully fill. For the first time since his high school years, Eddie understood that the people who had built this band with him would not stay forever. It was a harsh lesson in the impermanence of human connection, taught in the most painful way possible. The band continued forward, but something fundamental had shifted. Albums were released and tours continued, but the foundation was cracking in ways that became increasingly difficult to ignore. Then came the moment that would define the final chapter of Queensryche's classic era. In 2012, after more than 3 decades of partnership, Jeff Tate was fired from the band. The decision sent shockwaves through the rock world. In the eyes of most fans, Tate was Queensryche. His voice was inseparable from the band's identity. His dismissal was not a quiet transition like DeGarmo's departure. It was a public explosion, followed by lawsuits and years of bitter legal battles. The people who had stood together on thousands of stages now found themselves on opposite sides of a courtroom. For Eddie Jackson, watching friends become adversaries was a betrayal that cut deeper than any business dispute could explain. These were not strangers fighting over money or rights. These were the people he had grown up with, people he had shared his adult life with, people he had believed would stand beside him forever. The legal settlement eventually gave Michael Wilton, Scott Rockenfield, and Eddie Jackson the right to use the Queensryche name. Tate moved forward on his own path. The courtroom battle ended, but the damage was permanent. The classic lineup, the one that had created Operation, Mindcrime and Empire, the one that had defined an era, was officially over. Todd La Torre became the new vocalist, and while he was a talented musician, he represented a band that was fundamentally different from what had come before. By the late 2010s, even Scott Rockenfield began to fade from the picture. The friend Eddie had met in high school was no longer appearing regularly on stage or in the studio. One by one, the people who had journeyed with Eddie from the very beginning were moving on to different paths, leaving him as one of the last remaining threads connecting the band's present to its past. Today, in his 60s, Eddie Jackson continues to record and tour with Queensryche. Many of the faces from those early Seattle days are gone. But he remains, still playing, still creating, still honoring the music that has defined his entire life. His legacy is not built on fame or headlines. It is built on endurance, on loyalty, and on the quiet strength of someone who chose to stay when everything around him was falling apart.